Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three martinis coming up.
Hey, very glad you're with us for the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Good, bad, and crazy martinis coming straight up for you with the good news coming out of the EPA. Boy, you're never going to get that during a Democratic administration. Bad news from Russia, big surprise. And then crazy news coming from the world of politics and future campaigns. But Jim, we do want to do a quick clarification, quick commentary.
Yes, not a correction.
No.
Clarification for listeners who are slow.
Yesterday, our bad martini was the email that went out to a number of USAID employees that there was going to be an all-day, quote-unquote, group effort to destroy documents, according to Politico. Again, quote, shred as many documents first and reserve the burn bags for when the shredder becomes unavailable or needs a break. The email did not provide any reason for the document destruction. So we get a tweet in response to yesterday's podcast from a guy who doesn't use his real name. If it's a guy, don't even know if it's a guy, but seems to be an attorney based on the bio. And he says, hey, Jim Garrity.
We know who he is. It's not that hard to figure out. Go ahead.
You and Greg need to do a mea culpa tomorrow on you taking the bait from Politico about USAID document shredding. This person claims that there were comments cleaning it up from the White House. The only story I saw from the White House was while we were recording is when it was issued yesterday. And the Justice Department story, at least the one I've seen, came out late yesterday afternoon. So I'm not sure what clairvoyance we were supposed to have there. But then the more curious paragraph towards the end, to run with it the way you did, reading the report.
How dare you, Greg? Look out for that bus.
So to run with it the way you did, you needed to accept the proposition that 7 weeks into the Trump administration, after laying off most staff and canceling 85% of the grants, there would be an email sent to 40 people concerning a nefarious plot to destroy evidence. It's kind of when I think there probably would be a plot to do that, actually. But what's your take here?
Well, so first of all, our response and discussion and mockery yesterday is that this is remaining USAID employees who have been funding stuff that isn't going to be justifiable and that's going to look really embarrassing, or maybe the money's going to crooked, like that they have something to hide, therefore they're burning all the information. Shipwrecked Crew seems to think we were attacking the Trump administration and that this was some nefarious cover-up on the part of the Trump administration. Now, the Department of Justice came out and said, no, this email has been very seriously misapprehended. And that all records have been appropriately handled and nothing violated federal laws dictating the preservation of government documents. Look, I'll take their word for it if that's the case, but I just want to point out, first of all, the lesson that the U.S. Agency for International Development has a ton of classified documents is a bit surprising and not entirely reassuring. And then secondly, the fact that they have so much, they intend to destroy them, and that they fully expect the shredder will break down during this process. That too struck me as newsworthy and less than fully reassuring. Shipwrecked Crew thinks we were attacking the Trump administration. No, we were looking at this from the point of view of what are they trying to hide here? But nonetheless, Shipwrecked Crew has found the true villains in this story. The true villains, of course, are Greg and I for having the audacity to notice this and talk about this. So, sorry, Shipwrecked Crew. I'm sorry we ruined your day. Clearly. Now, maybe if you listen a little more clearly, you'll get what we're, we do. Apparently, I talk fast. And apparently, I talk so fast that people think I mean the exact opposite of what I said. So, if you play this podcast at maybe 75% speed, you'll get it and everything will work out fine. I hope this clarification you find satisfactory. Aren't you glad you went after us on Twitter? Didn't that work out well for you?
I'm sure that'll smooth everything over. But I love also, I says, it's normal house cleaning. Jim, I've moved before. I've moved offices. I've moved homes. You know what I didn't do?
Burn bags? Normal house
cleaning?
Burned
a lot of stuff before I left. I don't know. Different office, I guess. But anyway.
The Towering Inferno was just doing some refurbishing too, right?
All right, well, let's get to the real good martini now. And one of the appointees in this administration that we were pretty excited about from the very beginning is former Congressman Lee Zeldin. If the voters of New York, or at least a majority of them, had good judgment, he'd be the governor right now. But nonetheless, he's the EPA administrator, and he is already making waves in a very good way. This is from MSNBC, but Zeldin wrote for the Wall Street Journal, promising to drive, quote, a dagger through the heart of climate change religion, unquote. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Lee Zeldin on Wednesday outlined plans for an aggressive rollback of environmental regulations. In a Wall Street Journal opinion piece and an EPA news release, Zeldin announced he intends to reconsider more than a dozen core EPA rules and regulations, including those pertaining to emissions standards for vehicles, pollution from power plants, and the finding that provides the scientific basis for addressing climate change. The EPA announced it will revisit water pollution limits for coal plants, air quality standards for small particles, and the mandatory reporting of greenhouse gas emissions by large emitters. He also signaled the EPA would consider upending its own endangerment finding, a 2009 legal decision that says greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane are warming the earth and present a threat to public health and welfare. They also take on the waters of the United States rule. If you dig into that, you know how insane and burdensome that can be on property owners. But here is Zeldin last night on the Laura Ingraham Show on Fox News explaining his whole approach here.
The death of the Green New scam is upon us. And there are people who are congressional Democrats who are not going to be happy with our actions. I am here to fight for, as part of that Trump mandate, earned November 5th, the people across this country who have seen a Green New Deal that, if fully implemented, will cost tens of trillions of dollars, and people who cannot afford to be able to heat their home, to purchase a car, small businesses that are struggling to operate. People have been put out of work, and it's going to end. And
it has been a scam ever since the early 1990s, probably even earlier than that. You always have the UN or Al Gore saying, oh, within 10 years, it's always 10 years, because there has to be just enough time to fix it with big government programs. All this stuff's going to fall apart on the planet. And if you go back and look at those projections, they've been way off, and then they just make even more dramatic predictions. So good for Lee Zeldin, good for common sense. And like he said elsewhere in the interview, this doesn't mean the quality of your air, your land, or your water is going to change. It's just going to be the government getting off your back.
Greg, everyone should read that op-ed written by EPA Administrator Zeldin in the Wall Street Journal. But I want to point out that the first scoop about the overhaul of the endangerment finding was run at 1:56 p.m. by our Audrey Fahlberg at National Review Online. So Audrey covered the Congress for us for a long time, and she was killing it there. The only reason I'm going to say she's not killing it now that she's on the White House beat is because I don't want her to get in trouble with the U.S. Secret Service. Secondly, I'm not going to say, oh, thank goodness New York voters selected Kathy Hochul. I think all in all, that's still been really bad for the New York State. But New York State's loss has been the EPA's gain, and the entire country gets to enjoy the benefits. And I would just say for Democrats or anybody else who really wants to oppose Zeldin and hates what he's doing at the EPA, look, do not underestimate him. He's going to be a very tough guy to get rid of. You can even try to stab him, and he's just going to keep coming back and keep going at it. That was the last time they tried. By the way, this guy who stabbed him out on bail later that afternoon, to give you a sense of how Hochul's tough on crime policies were doing. But anyway, kudos to Zeldin. We'll see. Keep a close eye on these changes as they move forward.
Exactly. And we like conservative, deregulatory type EPA administrators. I think he's going to be a great one. I think Andrew Wheeler in the first Trump administration was pretty good. Another good one back in the day was Ann Burford, the first EPA administrator for President Reagan, who the media and the left absolutely savaged. But be careful who you savage, left and media, because you never know what origin story you're going to create. Ann Burford's son is Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, perhaps the most libertarian person we've ever seen on the court. So well done. Well done. Payback is tough, isn't it?
If you strike me down, I will come back more powerful than you can possibly imagine. Yeah. Kids are watching.
Even more good news now, and that comes in the form of artificial intelligence. You might be a little weirded out by it or may think it's a bit overhyped, but the fact is it's here. We use it just about every day, from self-driving cars to molecular medicine to business efficiency. And if it's not directly involved in your industry yet, it's coming, and it's coming fast. But AI needs a lot of speed and computing power. So how do you compete without your costs spiraling out of control? Well, it's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud. Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI.
OCI is a blazing fast and secure platform for your infrastructure, database, application development needs, plus all of your AI and machine learning workloads. OCI costs 50% less for computing and 80% less for networking, so you'll be saving a pile of money. Thousands of businesses have already upgraded to OCI, including Vodafone, Thomson Reuters, and Suno AI.
Right now, Oracle is offering to cut your current cloud bill in half if you move to OCI. This is for new U.S. customers with minimum financial commitment. Offer ends March 31st. So see if your company qualifies for this special offer at oracle.com/martini. That's oracle.com/martini. All right, Jim, on to our bad martini. Could also be described as not a surprise. The Russians have decided they don't want a ceasefire with Ukraine. Newsweek again with the story. The senior Kremlin official rejected the idea of a temporary ceasefire as proposed by U.S. President Donald Trump's administration, saying Russia was only interested in a long-term resolution of the Ukraine conflict. Yuri Yushakov, an aide to President Putin, gave an interview to the Russia One TV channel. But of course, Russia can't make that their PR. A Reuters story also says Russia has presented the U.S. with a list of demands for a deal to end its war against Ukraine and reset relations with Washington. We still don't know exactly what those conditions are. In the wake of this other announcement, they do want direct negotiations with the United States. So the question now, Jim, becomes, Trump put a lot of pressure, said a lot of things that weren't too nice about Zelensky. Now that the Russians haven't gone along with Trump's plan, will we see similar tactics?
Well, I just want to point out that we've got the Russian, effectively, foreign policy advisor to Putin saying this is just going to be a breather for Ukrainian troops. We're not interested in this. At the exact same time, Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Maria Zakharova says we are ready to discuss the initiatives set out there in future contacts with the United States. Such contacts are already possible as early as today. And also, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Petrov says negotiators are indeed flying in and contacts are indeed planned. We won't get ahead of ourselves. We'll talk about it afterward. Greg, what we have here is Schrodinger's foreign policy. The Russians are simultaneously rejecting the ceasefire and willing to have negotiations about the ceasefire. Listeners know my perspective on this. I trust the Russians about as far as I can throw them, and I suspect that if Russia does agree to a ceasefire, it's going to be about as good as one signed by Hamas. Russia has broken ceasefires and peace agreements in Georgia, in Chechnya, after the Crimean occupation. This is what they do. Putin is a former KGB operative. He lies for a lifetime. And in fact, the entire conflict in Ukraine began with what's sometimes called gray zone war or shadow war, the use of the quote-unquote little green men, in which Russian soldiers, without Russian insignias, but wearing Russian uniforms and using Russian weapons, advanced into these oblasts in the east of Ukraine. But Russia insisted, we're not at war. Hey, we don't know where those guys came from. They could be anybody. Of course, never mind the fact that they were actually doing television interviews in which they said, yeah, we're Russians. The entire time the Kremlin was insisting, well, they could be anybody. We have no idea what's going on there. So if their whole modus operandi is to fight wars without declaring them, I'm really not sure how much good a Russian signature on a ceasefire agreement is going to do. Look, I'd love to see peace come to this area. I just don't think the Russians want to do that. I think that, the only thing that will force the Russians to stop are casualties on a level that are unsustainable. And let's keep in mind that they've, in the last year, they occupied the amount of ground that they advanced was about 2/3 the size of the state of Delaware. And they had roughly one Vietnam War's worth of American casualties in order to get that. So my sneaking suspicion is actually all this talk about Russia's winning the war is wildly overstated. It's an ugly stalemate. It's a meat grinder for the Russians. And if we had managed to keep helping the Ukrainians, we had a much better chance of forcing the Russians to the negotiating table to get a deal that was more likely to lead to a secure and stable, independent Ukraine. We'll see how this goes. I think the entire U.S. policy has been way too many carrots towards Russia, way too many sticks towards Ukraine, morally inverted. And what's more, I just don't think it's going to work. I think whatever offer you put on the table, Putin's going to demand more. And then, of course, then he's not going to honor his side of the agreement anyway. We'll see what happens. The fact that they have these blatantly contradictory messaging is not encouraging. I wish Rubio and Waltz and all these guys out there well, but I see no reason to think that Russia's attitude towards the war in Ukraine has really changed one iota.
What pressure could Trump, if he wanted to, apply on Russia for not going along with what Trump wants to do? You mentioned in the Morning Jolt earlier in the week, there's not a lot more in terms of diplomatic penalties that we can apply, but what do you think he might do?
Well, he mentioned, sanctions and tariffs. And one, we're not doing much trade with Russia at all. Two, we pulled just about every lever In fact, upon taking office, some of the Department of Justice said it was going to stop targeting Russian oligarchs and stuff like that. So I guess you could put them back into place, but they were in place up until January 20th. So it's not like this would be a dramatic change of things. I think the single most dramatic move you can make is increasing the types of weapons that are permitted to you, that you send to Ukraine, and where Ukraine's allowed to use them. There's this similarly asinine narrative that Joe Biden was some sort of hero to Ukraine, when in fact first of all, it took him 6 months to decide every time whether, the Ukrainians would request a weapons system, Patriots, F-16s, missile batteries, HIMARS, the whole 9 yards. And Joe Biden would hem and haw, and then he'd say, yes, okay, I've decided you do get it. But you can only use it in these areas. You can only attack it in these. You can't go too far into Russia and stuff like that. Now, using homemade drones, Ukraine is launching drone attacks and got all the way to Moscow. And to me, the attitude to a bunch of Ukrainians who I've spoken to when I'm over there, the war will only end when Russians feel the consequences of the war in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. And having drones flying through the skies of Russian airspace is one of the ways to do that. Also blowing up Russian oil refineries, which also the Biden administration didn't want. Look, Ukraine's the underdog. They have to use every move they can get. And so my attitude is, if they actually had a U.S. president who wanted Ukraine to win the war, well, then, yeah, Russia would really recognize the consequences are very high, and maybe they'd start looking for a way to back out of this. But I don't think that scenario is going to happen anytime soon.
Well, we'll see what happens next, but your skepticism is well-founded, and it certainly has got plenty of precedent behind it, sadly. All right, well, today's podcast is brought to you by BetterHelp, and think about how much people spend on therapy as opposed to the type of quality therapy you could get at BetterHelp, because normally you can spend anywhere from $100 to $250 per session. That adds up pretty fast, especially if you're doing it every week. But with BetterHelp Online Therapy, you can save on average of 50% per session. And with BetterHelp, you just pay a flat fee for weekly sessions, which saves you big on cost and time.
With more than 30,000 therapists, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, and it's served more than 5 million people all around the world. And it's convenient. You can join a session with the click of a button, helping you fit therapy into your busy life. And you can switch therapists at any time.
Think about the convenience of that right there. If you have to actually go to someone in person, you feel like they're not the right therapist for you, and then you get to do it over and over again until you find the right one. This process can work a lot faster at a lot lower cost at BetterHelp. Your well-being is worth it. Visit BetterHelp.com/3ML to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/3ML. All right, Jim, on to our crazy martini now, and we are expecting an official statement later today, if it hasn't already come out. Maybe it already has by the time most folks hear this, that Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, former part-time transportation secretary, has decided after taking a close look at the Michigan Senate race that he's not going to do it. It seemed like all the indicators were pointing into the direction that he would, but now it looks like he's not going to do it, and the reason is because he's probably going to run for president in 2028. And so Gary Peters, of course, announced several weeks back that he's not going to run for re-election. That surprised a bunch of people. So far, the only Democrat in the race that I'm aware of is State Senator McMorrow, who's kind of a cultural activist on the left. The Republicans are still searching, trying to see if Mike Rogers wants another go at it since he came so close against Alyssa Slotkin last year. But basically, this race is wide open again. I don't know that Buttigieg would have given Democrats better or worse odds. I obviously had good name recognition, but not necessarily the right fit for Michigan since he's only lived there for about 15 minutes. So, Jim, what do you make of Buttigieg thinking, you know what, I'm not going to bother with the Senate. It's time for me to go for the top job again.
First of all, Greg, it's a great day for Michigan. The sun is shining.
Yes.
Detroit Lions signed DJ Reed. There's a lot of reasons to feel good about it. And they're not dealing with Buttigieg because he wants to run for president. By the way, there are a lot of days where I'll either, talk about what I wrote in the Jolt or quote it. Readers and listeners, you have no idea how proud I am that I worked in a reference to him as former Secretary of Delayed Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. And it got through. The editors let that go through. I think they noticed it. I think they get the joke. I don't know if he really was a top tier potential Democratic Senate recruit. Yes, he and his husband had bought property out there, but he'd been down in Washington for the past 4 years. And before that, he'd been in South Bend, Indiana. So it's not like he had particularly deep roots. High name ID, but I don't know if it's necessarily, overflowing love for him. I just figured there's got to be some better option out there. The idea of him running for president in 2028, besides, was it Trump said that, the American president's never going to look like Alfred E. Newman? And once he said that, nobody could get the image out of their head. Like, I figure if you're the Democrats, look, God only knows what the circumstances of the country are going to be in 3.5 to 4 years. God only knows what the circumstances of the world are going to be. Look, maybe Republicans will have really low poll numbers, and maybe it'll be a great year to be a Democrat running for president. But if it isn't, and if the circumstances are comparable to 2024, I think Democrats need a wartime consigliere. And Greg, do you see Pete Buttigieg as a wartime consigliere?
He is not Robert Duvall. Not at all.
Right. The art, yes, he served in the military, but I think he just doesn't come across, he comes across as the really bright kid who sits at the front of the class and reminds a teacher they forgot to assign homework for the weekend. And if he wants to go out and try to dispel that image, great. I don't think his time as transportation secretary did much to do that. I don't think, he and Sanders effectively tied for the Iowa caucuses. This is back when they couldn't count the votes in January 2020, and we thought that was the worst thing that was going to happen that year. I don't think there's an enormous clamoring for him to be the next president of the United States. The name that kind of intrigues me, you talk about a wartime consigliere, Rahm Emanuel is probably about as close as you get to that. I mean, like quite literally, as in sending dead fishes to people. And so I figure if Democrats are looking for toughness in 2028, then that's probably, and I also figure they're going to say, okay, Harris didn't work. Who do we have who's the opposite of Kamala Harris? I think, Rahm Emanuel's probably a better bet than that than Pete Buttigieg, but we'll see. It's still very early. I do think it's fascinating. I also kind of wonder if he looked at that Michigan Senate race and figured it was not an easy a win. But more likely, he figured if he did win, he'd have to turn around and start running for president within 10 minutes. And, only folks like Barack Obama do that.
That's exactly right. And you're on Twitter way too much, just like I am. And so I'm sure you see a lot of these accounts where people are just fawning over Pete Buttigieg's ability to go on Fox and spar with the hosts. And they just think he's the greatest communicator since Reagan or Cicero, or take your pick of a great communicator. And all you have to do is listen to him for about 30 seconds. You go, it's easy to sound convincing when you're completely making it up.
Was it Woody Allen who said something like 80% of life is showing up? And Karen Bass never got that memo. But nonetheless, the idea that okay, good for you for going on Fox. I think if you're a Democrat, you should go on Fox News. I think if you're a Democrat, you should go on. You should not shy away from certain venues. Because you should be able to demonstrate that I can stand up for my beliefs and I can stand up for our record against a tough host. But that said, showing up and doing a good job are not synonymous, and I think that there's definitely a lot of the Buttigieg fan base, such as it is, really they saw what they wanted to see in those appearances, and I don't think he should be counting on that to fuel him to the Democratic nomination in 2028.
Well, when the head of your party was the guy who just trailed off in the middle of sentences, being able to complete a paragraph coherently is going to look pretty good. So, exit question, McLaughlin style. Will the Senate Democrats who are filibustering the continuing resolution to keep the government open actually be assigned the blame if the government shuts down? Unlikely, mostly because voters usually have a pox on both your houses' responses to all government shutdowns. But I do think we should salute, Greg, we should pause and salute Senate Democrats who said they're angry about Doge. They're angry about what they consider to be abusive treatment of federal employees. And in order to show that they're not going to take this line down, they're shutting down the government. That'll show them. Makes a lot of sense. We're standing up for you, federal workers. Oh, by the way, you're not getting paid for the foreseeable future. Good luck. Yes. Jim, have a great day. See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow, Greg. Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Please subscribe to our podcast, The 3 Martini Lunch, if you don't already, and tell your friends to do it as well. We'd love to have them listening. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Greg Corombos. Have a great Thursday. Join us again Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.